Hi, welcome back. We continue today in the flood story near the very end of it in chapter 8, verses 20 to 22. We're only going to look at 3 verses today, but there's a lot going on here. And curiously, in my own research, whether in the past when I've been working on Genesis originally more than a decade ago, or recently in preparation for the series, I'm surprised at how little scholarly commentary there is on these 3 verses. And there's a lot going on there that raises some interesting questions. So I'm looking forward to exploring some of that with you here in just a moment. But as we do, let's look at the narrative context and the transition and see where we are. So we're going to be in verse 20 today, and so you see in the verses above that, we saw everything being commanded and obediently following the command to exit the ark. And then Noah comes out and builds an altar, and Yahweh's pleased with that, and all is well, right? As you can see in these classic paintings, whether this Renaissance painting from 1640 of Noah building an altar and the animals around and the rainbow and it all looks good, or in this modern version from an anonymous painter, where it's all just so pretty and colorful, reminiscent of the children's games and things we saw at the very beginning of this sequence of how the Noah's Ark story is turned into just this happy-go-lucky family story, and Noah is sort of like Santa Claus. But then we can look at this New Yorker cartoon from 2016 and maybe get a little more of a sober view of what's really going on there. Because when Noah comes out of the ark, what is he going to see? A nice clean beach and trees growing and animals from the ark all playing and having a wonderful time? Well, 2 things. Not only will there be the dead bodies, it's only been a year according to the story, and so they'd be dead and drowned, but they wouldn't have completely disappeared. They would have been bloated and rotted, and all the bones would be there, and it would be a horrible stinking mess, of course, of all the humans and all the animals on the earth all lying there dead. That's one thing. But another thing is, as we saw, it said the ark landed in the mountains of Ararat, contrary to the traditional misunderstanding that there was a single mountain called Mount Ararat. And as we looked at a few videos ago, there is one in Armenia now, but based on this story, not based on something else. But if we picture it at Mount Ararat, 15,000 feet above sea level, Noah is not exactly in this beach-like setting here or in someplace warm. He's up in the snowy mountains at 15,000 feet and would have quite the trek down to where, in a scene or so, we'll see that he not only builds the altar here, but plants a vineyard. So scholars have to deal with readers' presuppositions that often penetrate into scholarly presuppositions about the nature of this exit scene. And that's what I want to raise here so we can hear it not through this soft, fuzzy lens of rainbows and animals, but through the colder, precise lens of reading the text as it actually has it here. And there are some dark ironies for us to take account of. So although the text doesn't say anything about what it looked like on the outside or where they are on the outside or anything about that, we see this immediate response from Noah. Then Noah built an ark to Yahweh. Notice this is the first thing he's doing here after following the command to fulfill the ark. Yahweh has not given him a further command. The last command was to come out of the ark. So he's doing this on his own. There's no sense that he's supposed to do this any more than there was for Cain and Abel back in chapter 4 to make their offerings to Yahweh, which we saw was strange then. There's no altar mentioned, just made an offering to Yahweh back in chapter 4. But here Noah builds an altar to Yahweh, and then it says, took of every clean animal and every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So let's pause and consider what that's saying. After having fulfilled the command to save all these animals from God's violent destruction of all living creatures on earth, the first thing that Noah does in leaving the ark is engage in a mass slaughter of animals, presumably because that's what Yahweh wants. And it's a very strange thing here. As readers, we should be shocked at that, especially before we get to verse 21. Why in the world would Yahweh want Noah to destroy some of the very animals that he took such pains to save? Does Yahweh demand this kind of sacrifice as a thanks or anything else? It doesn't give any reason why Noah's doing this. It says offered burnt offerings. They're not named as often they are in other contexts in the Hebrew Bible as sacrificial offerings or guilt offerings or praise offerings. There's no particular purpose mentioned, although we can certainly expect that it has something to do with gratitude for surviving and for the ordeal being over. But none of that is actually mentioned here. So before we go to verse 21, let's look at a couple more details of verse 20 and where we are in our story. So, as you can see on the right side, I've had up for each of these videos in the sequence a traditional separation of Genesis 6 and 9 into the J and P flood stories. And as you can see on the right column of this page here, the verses we're looking at today are the final verses of what scholars understand to be the J version. It's a strange way to end in a certain way, and it's very different than what we'll see next time in the P version with the New Covenant and the changed conditions in relation to violence and killing, as we'll see. So we're focusing on that. And that's important here for a couple of reasons. One is, to the extent that we've been looking at echoes of Genesis 1 in the flood story that you can see here, Genesis 1 is a P story, and so our J author, or non-P author, as scholars say now, wouldn't presumably know about the P version of the creation in Genesis 1, but knows about the Garden of Eden version, which is this author's version of that. And so we'll see in 8:20 to 22 at least one echo of the Garden of Eden story rather than of the original creation 1 story. And further, we've been looking at how to follow this in terms of how the entire section is structured, and so we've been following more closely the version here in blue from my version of this adapted from others. So we're down in the C prime section there, 8:20 to 22, God's resolve to preserve, that matches the C section back in 6:13 to 22. God's resolve to destroy. Although there's an interesting parallel here that's different that we'll see when we look more closely at it. This is one option, and as we've been looking at, Wenham has a different chiastic shape of the whole business here. He has 8:20 as part of the whole last section of to 9:17, so he plainly is ignoring the J and P aspects of it to see a different kind of parallel, as he argues throughout his commentary for a unified reading of it. And then Cassuto's 2 sets of 6 paragraph version has us here as these verses as simply part of the exit before the blessing in chapter 9. So another aspect of what we're looking at here is Noah built an altar. So this little chart that we looked at once before, back in 417, has Noah amongst the builders. And many scholars have noted that, as you can see there on my chart, the Hebrew banah here for built is different than the word for made here you see down here, asa, for what God commanded to do with the ark. He didn't build an ark, he made an ark. And that may seem like a semantic difference without a distinction, without a difference to our ears. But the commanding of building, or the act of building, is a very specific thing in Genesis. As you can see that God built humans back in 2:22. We don't normally think of humans being built, so that sounds strange to our ears. But when we look at the things that are built in Genesis, it gives us a sort of a pattern here of what God does and what people do. So God built humans, Cain built a city, Noah built an altar to Yahweh, Nimrod, as we'll see, will build Nineveh, and humans will build a Tower of Babel. Then we'll see others offer further altars, Abraham offering an altar, Isaac offering an altar, and then Jacob offering an altar. And then finally, we'll see Jacob erects an altar using a different verb there, but I included that one there. So the building of an altar. Altar is Mizbecha here, first time in Genesis, and you can see it's a number of times. Scholars who've traditionally seen the J story is older than the P story, thus the P story has J, but J doesn't have P, wonder about the P author, whose verses come after this, leaving in a passage about an altar and sacrifice here in this primordial period, given many scholars have said it's important to the P view that sacrifice and altars begin at Mount Sinai, that that's really the start of the story of Israel's relationship with their God, Elohim, and the P version of it. But here it is, and it's also one of those suggestions that the original view that the J story was much older than the P story, it needs to be adapted, and scholars have been doing that, more likely to see J and P as both exilic, or perhaps even after exilic. So we can no longer follow that pattern here, and it's perhaps something to raise of whether we can also assume that the J author doesn't know Genesis 1. Maybe in exile they do know each other's stories, but we'll probably never be able to know that. So he builds an altar to the Lord and then takes of every clean animal and every clean bird. In the images I showed you from paintings and even from the cartoon, you see what's the equivalent of like a backyard barbecue or something, where you could cook a couple of chickens at a time or maybe a few ribs. But every clean animal, this is massive death. Massive sacrifice. All we saw in the Cain and Abel story was that Cain brought from the flock and Abel brought from the produce of the land. It doesn't say how much, but certainly not this vision of mass sacrifice. And it raises a number of theological and narrative challenges here, and I can just suggest the topics without attempting to try to resolve them. One is this cycle of violence that we've seen here, and this will be important too with what follows up in whether it's the P version or just the continuation of the story in the beginning of chapter 9, where in that case God, not Yahweh, adapts the conditions and then recreates things with violence built into it. But is it just human violence or divine violence? What's exactly at issue here? And so originally we saw that God was regretting having made humankind because humans filled the earth with violence. Then God ups that and fills the earth with much more violence, however violent it was before the flood. Obviously the flood wiped out all living moving things on the earth. So divine violence was much greater than the human violence that preceded it. And now the first act after the flood is a massive act of human violence that was not directed by Yahweh. Is this reflecting that Noah and Yahweh have the same image in them, and the issue of violence is simply built into the divine image that is now in the image of humankind? That's a disturbing suggestion, but I at least have to put it out there, because what we see in verse 21 is that God is happy with this. Rather than God saying, I didn't command you to do this, why are you doing that? As we see Jesus do to his disciples often in the New Testament when they take upon themselves a path of following what they believe to be God's way, and it's not what Jesus understands to be God's way. Or as we saw in the Garden of Eden, when the woman eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and God intervenes and says, what are you doing? But Yahweh does not intervene here to say, what are you doing? Why are you killing these animals that I asked you to save? Rather, we see this in verse 21. And there are a couple of translation issues to look at, but I just want to focus first on what we see in the New Revised Standard. And when Yahweh smelled the pleasing odor, Yahweh said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. A lot going on there. First, let's look at the verse itself and where it sits in here. As White notes here, the reinstitution of sacrifice after Cain and Abel coincides with the reconciliation of God to man's evil imagination. In other words, it's plain that God sees, Yahweh here sees, that humans are not going to change, have not changed, and are not going to change, so something different has to happen. But we have to look at this more closely to see what's really going on here. As Wenham notes, the issue of and when raises the question of the causal relation here between sacrifice and God's changed heart. He suggests, in the quote you see, it's wrong to see propitiation and thanksgiving as mutually exclusive interpretations of the burnt offering in general and here as well. But I'd like to suggest that perhaps a little bit misses the point, as we'll see in just a moment. So let's look at a few of the details more closely. The word for smelled here, and smelled here, vayarach, is very similar to ruach, spirit, and you can hear how that suggests something that we saw back from chapter 2, verse 7. When in the Yahweh story of the Garden of Eden, God made humankind by taking some of the topsoil and breathing the breath of life through its nostrils, and it became a living being. So the nostrils are the place through which air comes and smells come. So in that sense, smelling is like using the spirit, the air, the wind, and taking that in. So it's obviously metaphorical about God. But an interesting little note here, how the Hebrew links this, the spirit and the nose with smelling here. But what I really want to focus on is the question of pleasing odor. The word here, YHWH, here, which, as many people have noted, has consonants similar to Noah, and as my note there down below says, embeds a reminder of Noah in the text that describe Israel's ritual life. But the issue is, it's normally translated as pleasing, but when you look in the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon, we see that it can also mean quieting or soothing or tranquilizing, which gave me the image that you see here of smoking bees to calm them down. And we note that what we're hearing here, according to the actual meaning of the word, is not that it's pleasing to God in the sense that God approves of it or it meets God's preferences for the kind of smells God likes, but it's taking a God who is regretting having made humankind and engaging in illicit evil and calming God's spirit. through the smoke of the offering here. Does Noah know that that's what he's doing? He has no reason to believe that God can be smoked out like a hive of bees can. Certainly the Israelites knew about bees. In my Samuel series that I'm doing at the same time as I'm working on these, we know there's a big question about bees and honey there, and Samson and the bees, of course, and the book of Judges. So they certainly had plenty of experience with bees. And would have perhaps recognized that. But in any event, whether we associate it with bees or not, it's a sense of Yahweh here being soothed and tranquilized. And so what comes after this, what Yahweh says, is coming within Yahweh's own heart, spoken to nobody in particular, not explicitly, not to Noah, but certainly to readers here, of a tranquilized Yahweh. And so what we hear is, I will never again curse the ground. Couple of things to look at here. The word for curse here, kalal, is the word that we saw earlier for make small. It's a milder word, as Wenham notes, than aror at 3:17, when the curse word was used back in the Garden of Eden story. So although this seems to be recalling the Garden of Eden, as we'll see also from the language of the rest of the phrase here, it uses a different word. The other parts that echo the Garden of Eden we can see here. Will not curse the ground because of humankind. Et ha'adamah ba'avor ha'adam. I will not curse the Adamah because of Adam. Notice what God is promising not to do isn't about humans, but it's about the earth. That what God's recognizing, it was a mistake to include the earth in the suffering here that was caused by humankind. Humankind, as the text continues to say, inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. We'll come back to that in a second. But it's not the ground's fault. It's not the Adamah's fault. So God will now separate out the fate of the Adamah and its animals, as we'll see in the next section, from that of humankind, separating out the ongoing goodness of the earth from the inclination of the human heart. And that's something we need to look at here. The word for inclination here, yetzer, is a form of what we saw in 6:5, although it's literally the only time this word is used. It's one of those many words that's only used in these passages, as you can see here. From our chart of that, but is evil from youth. And notice what that's saying and what it's not saying. It's not saying, as my note suggested, this is like original sin. This is not Augustine's sense of original sin passed by sexual procreative activity and what he called concupiscence. It's not anything built in. In other words, God is disclaiming the responsibility for it. In the ways we might put it, it's nurture, not nature. It's not that the human heart is evil from creation, but from youth. Something that God can't quite name here is being passed on, and so that humans come out being evil, even though God is now implicitly saying, it's not my fault, I didn't make them evil. And we can call that genetics, we can call that nurture, we can call that heredity, we can call that the kind of social order that passes on from one to another, as we saw in the Cain story back in chapter 4, where Cain, seventh generation Lamech, accelerated the violence that he had inherited from his ancestor Cain. So that seems to be what's suggested here, although it's not made specific. But it is pretty clear that Yahweh is saying it's not my fault, and yet there's nothing I can do about it. I can't stop human beings from being evil. So I will not curse the earth for that reason, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. The word for destroy here is not the same word that we saw for what humans were doing that caused the flood or what God did in response, but the word nikah there literally meaning smite, and we saw it earlier in 4:15. We'll see it a lot in chapter 14 as what these local kingdoms do as they're having war against each other. So one could frame that as I would not attack every living creature, I'll not war with every living creature. It's not the literal word for war, but smiting certainly suggests that kind of battle to destroy an enemy. So God will not see living creatures as enemies, nor will curse the ground again as a result of this. But this is all flowing out of what God, Yahweh here, seems to be tranquilized by the smoke from mass death. And so as we continue into the next section and what follows with the rainbow, we're going to have to really take account of one of the themes that we looked at the very beginning of the character of God, whether that's under the name Elohim or Yahweh that we see throughout this flood story, contrary to what many of us may have inherited from a doctrinal sense of things. Plainly, the Genesis authors, whether it's in the question of how humans are to behave or in the question of how Yahweh are to behave, don't engage in abstractions or doctrinal kinds of statements to try to pin these things things down, but are telling open-ended, often ambiguous stories that allow readers then and now to explore many possibilities of how change and stability happen in relation to this relation between God, the earth, and one another at both ends of the relationship. And then we will close today with verse 22, which doesn't seem to follow from verse 21 and has got a lot of problems inside itself, but let's look at it for a moment closely and see. And as we do, I'll scroll here further to see how many of the words in this section are unique to this, so we can't get much context to know what either the Genesis authors or others thought of this, because some of these words are unique to right here. So, as Westerman notes, for the first time in the story of humanity, the cosmic event is seen as a whole in its extension in time. In other words, we're seeing human life in relation to the cycles of the earth. And the insight I'd like to offer here as we look at this verse, which reads, "As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease," is that the natural cycles that God had created will continue and will not be interrupted by a flood. Notice the Yahwist author doesn't say what the P author will tell us in the next sections, that God will never send a flood again, nor even destroy humans again, but will not again destroy every living creature. There will not be a massive death like this, but there are plenty of other Yahwistic threats of the day of the Lord, as you see throughout the Torah and then in the prophets, not under Yahwistic origin of source, but the same kind of theology of a God who will still find some kind of retribution in this life or beyond it in some texts for human misbehavior here. But the ground will not be cursed or made small, and not all living creatures will not be destroyed together. And then we see these four pairs here. First, let's look at this phrase, "as long as the earth endures," literally from the Hebrew, ad kal yemi ha'eretz, literally all the days of the earth, for the first time suggesting the earth has a period of life, like everything else, which ought not to surprise us. We saw the earth came into being in the first chapter, or at least order within the earth came into being. It isn't creation out of nothing, so we don't really see the earth appear out of nowhere. But we see its shape into a habitable place being formed, and yet it's suggesting here that that's if a long period, at least a temporary one, not a permanent one. So throughout the days of the earth, we see four pairs here. And scholars have struggled with how to make sense of these four pairs: seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. And so how do we look at those? Seed time and harvest, literally the word seed time just means zera, seed, has to do with human relationship, agriculture. And as we saw in chapter 3, agriculture was the curse. And so that's precisely the Adamah that was cursed there. And so is this understood as withdrawing the curse on the Adamah? The never again curse doesn't suggest the earlier one has been undone. But this verse 22 seems to suggest that God is expecting that seed and harvest are now built into the life cycle of the earth. Cold and heat are also issues as experienced by humans here. It's not a season or something on the calendar exactly. Kor for cold and hom for heat. Heat is only one other time in the Pentateuch, and that's in chapter 18, when Abraham and Sarah meet the three visitors in the heat of the day. Summer and winter, Kayetz here is only here in the Pentateuch, and winter, Choref here, is also only here in the Pentateuch. It's surprising perhaps to us that these seasons are not only part of Genesis, but not part of Exodus. But of course, Exodus are people on the move through the wilderness. They're not exactly settled people for whom the seasons are the primary issue. And then day and night, which is different than morning and evening, as we saw the creation story in chapter 1 look at. But this author of these verses is not an author of Genesis 1. There are a couple of ways to slice these, and no matter how we slice them, they don't quite fit together. So at least not in a way that makes linear sense. So if we consider, say, warm and cool pairs, in the first one, seed time and harvest, it's hard to say. If we think that is spring and fall, they're probably pretty even. Cold and heat, well, cold comes first, but summer and winter, the warm comes first. And day and night, in most contexts, the day is warmer than night. So a couple of times the warm partner of the pair comes before the cooler partner of the pair, so that doesn't seem to get us anywhere. And they're each of their own category, whether it's the seasons in themselves, summer and winter, or temperature, or light, or the opportunity to grow food. simply naming 4 cycles that will continue without apparent interruption. The word for shall not cease here is ironically the Sabbath word, and so it's ironic here, they will not Sabbath. Just as God ceased the creation in chapter 2 after the original creation, and humans are called to practice Sabbath, the earth and its seasons will not practice Sabbath in this way. One last thing, we've also been looking at how these stories echo or change the Babylonian stories, especially the Gilgamesh epic, and I want to draw back attention to one aspect of that here. So we've looked at the question of God smelling the tranquilizing odor in terms of just our narrative context, but I want to look at it as it contrasts the Gilgamesh story, and this little excerpt from chapter 11 highlights both what we saw previously. I referred to it, but I didn't bring this up here in the actual text, that the dove and the raven sent out by Noah echo in reverse order what we see in the Gilgamesh epic. But what I really want to focus on is here, because we're beginning to look at the end of the story and how not only the stories have similar elements, that is the Mesopotamian story and the Genesis story, but how their theologies and purposes are very different, which we'll look at more in the concluding video after the next couple as we finish the text itself. So we see here in this one, the speaker says, I sent out everything in all directions, the animals here, and sacrificed a single sheep, then offered incense in front of the mountain ziggurat, the ziggurat being the stepped pyramid that we'll look at again when we get to the Tower of Babel story. And then we see those other details, and then we see in the bolded part, the gods smelled the savor, the gods smelled the sweet savor, and collected like flies over the sacrifice. So in contrast with the single God Yahweh here smelling the sacrifice and then promising not to curse the ground again, here the gods gather around like flies, literally like flies according to the author. So a much less dignified sense of it, and certainly no sense that this smell is anything but placating the gods who are likened to scavengers over waste here. So just another example of how the Genesis authors are taking the tradition and rendering it in the theological terms that are important to them, and we'll see that as we reach the conclusion. So as we finish this section here, a lot to say for 3 verses. We're going to look back to the P section, and we're going to look at it both as if it was separate from the verses we just saw, but also in continuity with it, so we continue to see the character of God and the character of Noah as the story comes to an end. See you then. Bye-bye.